Morning, everyone. Joe, alcoholic. Been through this process with the help of God. Several big book step study sponsors. I'm more than halfway through step 9, and I practice 10, 11, and 12 to the best of my willingness on a daily basis. This is really an honor. Thank you, Jim, for having me come out and speak here. And just to reflect a little bit on the process here. I'm feeling some nerves right now, and it's really interesting because I just got done with some kind of high-stakes job interviews, and I had nothing near this level of stuff going on inside. So what that says to me is kind of like the third step promises, in that, just to the extent that I do as God would have me do, and I humbly rely on Him, does He enable me to match calamity with serenity. This isn't really a calamitous situation. Here I'm bearing witness to those I would help of God's power, love, and way of life, which means I have to tell the truth, So you can kind of see where that stuff's coming from. Anyways, my experience with step 1, this part of step 1, somebody once described this chapter, it could have an alternate title of Having an Alcoholic Mind. And that for me is really important because, as our literature says, by this point in the reading, as I was doing this with my sponsor, I came to realize that there's, something bodily going on. I learned about the phenomenon of craving, and we discussed the mental obsession during our reading of the doctor's opinion. Now we're getting more into that, and now it's a chapter about the alcoholic mind written by people with alcoholic minds, and as far as I can tell, that was the first time. This is like the most recent existing text of that, something that hadn't really been done before, and if it had, it was lost to the ages. So the first thing that I note in this, and that I really appreciate, is that when the discussion of alcoholism is brought up, usually by the people who don't understand or don't have the alcoholic mind themselves, the word denial is used a lot. You're in denial. Can't you see what you're doing to yourself? And this ties the doctor's opinion together with this. That's frothy emotional appeal that doesn't mean much to me. They can tell me that I'm killing myself and that I have so much to live for and that, all these other things that would normally knock some sense into a person. But for me, that doesn't address the root of the crap that I've got going on inside that really needs to be addressed. So there's much more powerful language than denial in here. We have illusion, obsession, and delusion right there in the first couple paragraphs of the chapter. And if I can start to relate to that my thinking is not just about denial. I'm not seeing one thing and saying no to it. I'm seeing one thing and fully believing that it doesn't exist. The issue that they're seeing is in full force in my life. I'm completely telling them that they're wrong. My butt may be on fire, and I'm going to tell them it's just a sunny day, So that type of thinking has to be smashed. And how do I go about that? I'm so thankful for this process and the way that it was laid out for me in terms of starting out with the reading, because they suggested to circle words that I didn't understand, find the definitions, and I was challenged on some of them. Some words that I'd been using my entire life that I really thought that I knew were brought up. One of them was concede. What does it actually mean to concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics? And the definition that I was given was to concede means to agree against one's will. Perfect for smashing that illusion, those delusions that I'm living under. And, a great easy bar to start out on as well. Because I don't necessarily have to accept all at once all of this information that somebody's given me, particularly about the alcoholic mind, because there's a lot in here. I can agree and I can grow in understanding over time. And that's really important because, if all of this information was forced down my throat, I'd probably explode before I understood it. But it got kind of spoon-fed, and there was regular discussion about this, and especially attending meetings like this, I got to hear all these different perspectives. I might have heard the same thing 1,000 times and it would have gone over my head, but the 1,001st, it finally smacks me right between the eyes, and that's the time that I heard it and when I needed it. So, I think going over here, there's this phenomenon that happens in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like where humor and wisdom intersect, and it's just gold. I was at a meeting like this one time, and there was an individual with a reading comprehension difficulty, and God bless him, he was reading, and it took him a long time to get through the paragraph, but he's trying out the paragraph on the very bottom of page 31. We don't like to pronounce an individual as an alcoholic, but you can diagnose yourself. He suggested, well, his reading was askew. He read it as step over to the nearest bathroom and try some controlled drinking. And of course, it was hilarious. And I'm thinking later on about how serious that actually is, because there's 2 experiments in this chapter. This one and the experiment of leaving the liquor alone for 1 year. You know, we live in a time now where alcohol might just be the first thing in a series of, non-alcoholic escapades that could potentially result in death for people. So we live in a time now where if I'm bringing someone through this work, this could be very damaging. And I know plenty of people have said, oh, the big book says I can try some controlled drinking, so they did that, and then years later they show back up here beaten worse than ever. So this for me has been just as much a thought exercise. I didn't actually, I had my experience in and out, but that was before Big Book. Now when I go through this with other people, and I should preface this by saying too, the chapter Working with Others suggests that we bring other folks through in the same way that they did it in this chapter. So there's just as much a 12-step discussion as there is a personal step 1 discussion going on here. But point that I'm getting at is I can think about this. I can relate to my own experience of stepping into the nearest bathroom and trying some controlled drinking. And if I step back and think of that objectively just for a second, again, having conceded at this point, now I can say, there might be something weird about that, I don't think many people are trying to control and regulate their drinking in a bathroom. And just maybe if I can conceive of that as being like an actual experiment that I might try, perhaps I've got an alcoholic mind. And I know a lot of folks that I bring that up to as well, they can agree. Controlled drinking in a bathroom is a lot more common in Alcoholics Anonymous than it is in the rest of the population. All right. So, yeah, the main thing in this, again, is where can I identify with the alcoholic mind? And they give us 4 stories in here. There's the carpet slipper guy, Jim, the jaywalker, and Fred. And all of them have different facets of it. There's the first alcoholic mind example, which really describes the idea that there can be reservations that we have. And, a reservation is basically, if this happens, then I'm doing that. In this guy's case, it was a little bit more noble than the catastrophizing that some of us, myself included, do. If I find out that I'm going to die in a couple weeks, then I'm going to go and drink. That's a common form of a reservation. This guy, if I find myself having a successful and happy business career, then I'm going to drink. And that happens, and we find that the alcoholic mind is still active, although it may have been subdued, and we don't get the information. We hear that the career is successful and happy in this account, but I'm kind of curious to know what his employees think, because, again, our doctor's opinion describes it, and my personal experience describes it too. When I'm away from a drink, if I'm an alcoholic, I'm restless, irritable, and discontented. This is, again, more fuel here. With this particular chapter being devoted to the second half of step 1, that my life had become unmanageable, we're getting into the idea of the mental obsession here. An obsession being a thought so powerful that it crowds out all ideas to the contrary. How am I to unthink a thought? And I can sit and relate to my own experience as well, and I remember counting the seconds. And, I'm still in and out in the program, and they're telling me, take it a day at a time. If a day at a time's too long, an hour at a time, a minute at a time. And, it was like one pet of my cat at a time, and I'm sitting there like rubbing all of her fur off, trying to make sure that I don't drink. And of course, after a while, that got old, and I went out and had a couple pops. So, what do I do when my mind is basically telling me put the thing into my body that kills me, right? If I can understand that is really what I'm up against me. How do I get in between me and me? I need power beyond me to drive the wedge down in there. So the idea of mental defenses, like, what I just described there and all of these other things, some of them may be successful and some of them may help out initially, but I heard it put a wonderful way. I can have 10,000 mental defenses that may be effective 10,000 times, but I'm absolutely hopeless on the 10,000th and first. Inevitably something will happen that will set all the tumblers in my mind going, and it'll click in just the right space and time, and I'm going to say F it, and then there I go. So how do I get that? I get that first by relating to all of these things, and then once I can relate and realize the gravity of all of this, how unmanageable life actually is, not because of all of the junk that I did when I was out there drinking, not because of the crashed cars, the broken relationships, the bankruptcies, etc., but because my thinking is fundamentally flawed, and I'm doomed to put the thing into my body that's causing this problem again if I don't take spiritual action. That's why my life is unmanageable. And I'm unmanageable still today because although I have a spiritual program in my life and I have a connection and a relationship with power beyond me, I also have that obsession still there. There's a wedge between me and me now, but if that is not maintained on a regular basis, that wedge falls out, and I still have that obsession that I'm still dealing with on my own. If I'm left to my own devices, that's still there. So, and another way of saying that, my life is unmanageable because I don't know when the next time this obsession is going to become so powerful that I'll be living in the delusion again, thinking that it won't burn me this time, here's how. So as I went through this, I had to demonstrate too that I had the desire to stop drinking. And it was kind of funny because at the time I was in the interim place. It was a spiritual bottom. It was a time of character defects, and although I was sober, I knew everything that everyone was going to say at the meeting before I got there. Really didn't want to go, especially did not want to think about the idea that I'm going to have to read the daily reflections for the rest of my life. I'm going to know everything in that book by the time I got sober at 22. I'm like, I'm going to know every day by the time I'm 30. I'm 30 now and I don't know the rest of the book. So, the idea here was that I was really starting to well up with character defects, part of which are the mental states which precede the first drink for me. So, if we go over to Jim's story there, with the whiskey and milk, it talks about how they first meet with him. I'm trying to find where his story starts in just a second. Well, regardless, he meets Alcoholics Anonymous upon coming out of an asylum, and they work with him, and he fails to enlarge his spiritual life. Then he's drunk half a dozen times in rapid succession. On each of these occasions, Alcoholics Anonymous works with him. So we've got 7 distinct in and out times, meetings with Alcoholics Anonymous before this whiskey and milk junk. And, failing to enlarge his spiritual life. In my situation, I was under the impression that I was enlarging my spiritual life when in fact I was circling the drain, And that really was a desperate place for me because it seemed like with the sponsor that I had at the time, all was going well. My 4th step took about 2 weeks and 20 minutes to write. 2 weeks of telling him I was writing it and 20 minutes of actually writing it. And similar thing with the 5th step there. I shared what I had written and then sprinkled in some other sex stuff to make it sound like those were the deep, dark secrets that I never share with anyone. And I was as, honest as I thought I could be at the time, but I think many of us might know where I'm going with this. It was really a failure to enlarge my spiritual life because I was leaving about this much room in this channel that was between myself and God, and clearly that could get clogged up with all sorts of things. So as we read in Jim's story here, he felt irritated that he had to be a salesman. He was hungry, stopped at the roadside bar thinking of halt there, and then all of a sudden he's eaten many sandwiches and many glasses of milk. Again, before even the whiskey goes in, I think if you count, there's something like 4 sandwiches and like 5 or 6 glasses of milk. The last few of them have whiskey in it. Like, what's actually going on here? To me, that smacks of character defects from my own personal experience. So, again, it describes it a little bit more in the fact that we may feel justified by nervousness. I felt very nervous, sober, going to meetings, just not drinking, and, being real lax with the step work there. And a drink seemed like a good idea. I felt jealous that some folks in AA just seemed to get it, and they were perfectly content with going to the same meetings over and over again, and knowing that, I had no idea what they were thinking, but it was clearly different than what I was thinking. And I'm like, how come you can be that way and I can't? And I felt like drinking, sober. Of course, angry. Of course, depressed. Same sort of things. So what's going on? I'm sober. My life is still unmanageable. Again, not because of the stuff that I was doing while drinking. I hadn't been drinking at the time. I had been living under the lash of the delusions here. These comparing myself to other people, all of these other things that I had to eventually come to terms with and for. But in the meantime, this is the same sort of stuff that will eventually lead up to that space where the mental blank spot takes hold. The only thing that I was doing was going to meetings and hearing other people talk about these things. And, maybe the grace of God, something would trickle in and say, like, you know what, I don't want to end up like that, so I'm not going to drink, even though I really want to. I'll go to another meeting, even though, this, that, and the other thing. The character defects were not resolved by not drinking and going to meetings. The only thing that happened there was some form of grace, and I feel completely honored and blessed to be put in the position where eventually the pain was so bad. A gentleman was speaking at a meeting one time, sharing completely off topic, but about one of the things that was a core fear of mine. And I knew I had to ask this man to be my sponsor, and he was the one that ended up taking me, the first Hyannis format big book sponsor that I had, was Ponytail Bill. And, that was really it. It was grow or go at that point. And so all of these things were really hammered home to me. One of the things that I guess I'll end with here is how, as I mentioned, they suggest to bring newcomers through in the way that alcoholism is described in here. And that's where Fred's story speaks to me so well. I mean, there's a lot that can really be touched on in this chapter, but in order to make this not an on and on meeting, I'm going to just stick to this last little bit. What it was like for me when I was approached is the same way that I like to approach other people. So, for example, they're explaining that willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. The idea of what a strange mental blank spot was, like, how many times did you actually think, I'm going to go to the liquor store, versus how many times did you just wind up there, And then how many times, too, did you not even think about any of that beforehand, and you're, halfway finished with the bottle, and you're going, wasn't I supposed to be sober today? Wasn't I trying something different? There was no willpower. It just didn't exist. There was very little self-knowledge. If I knew anything about that, it didn't seem to hold weight over, again, this obsession, this thought so powerful, it blocks out all ideas to the contrary. And of course, that's what the mental blank spot was like. And it's again expressed to me further that if I do not continue to enlarge my spiritual life, life will keep on lifing, and something will happen where I'm going to be placed in that position where I'm not thinking at all again, and all of a sudden, here's how, Then in the same token, there's other kind of fun little things. the folks grinned at Fred, which he didn't like so much. And I can certainly remember all of those grins and the handshakes and the "we're glad you're here, keep coming back" type things that I definitely didn't like so much. But this is, again, effective in not only my own recovery. I can see how much my disdain for that at the time was sort of the first intro into doing things despite the fact that I didn't really want to do them. I didn't want anything about it. And the discussion on hopelessness, where was my own hopeless experience? I'm driving around on a regular basis thinking that, this whole modern life that we live in was some sick dream. Like I'm thinking that the alcoholics came from Europe and attacked the original people here, and then, committed genocide and then built Springfield, like what a way to live, And so I'm using all of that as justification for my own stuff, not realizing the fact that I'm already in a hopeless condition. Again, I'm using the AA finger analogy. I'm pointing the fingers when in reality the problem is all in here and in here, my heart and in my mind. So the root of the situation is, what can I do about all of these things? And on that foundation of hopelessness, on the foundation of understanding that I have an obsession of the mind, a physical compulsion, I have the strange mental blank spots, I have the series of the well-known stages of a spree that will occur if I take that drink, all these other things. Once I've got all of that together in a nice little bundle, then I've got a hopeless situation, and the only natural consequence that can come after that for me is there are two natural consequences that come after that. Keep doing what I'm doing and, do it right into the grave, or accept spiritual help. And for me, it was so natural to, once I really got this hopelessness down, again, there's this whole fellowship of people out here that were also in that situation, and they're reaching out their hands saying, "Come on, this worked with us." I'm surrounded with the hope, So that was it for me, I was able to reach out to power beyond me at that point, once I've actually understood and discovered all of these things about myself. But it took the personal interactions, it took meetings like this, it took understanding the literature and discovery of all of these things to actually realize just how hopeless it was. And my experience with that is, when I found out exactly how hopeless it was only natural at that point that I'd really want to start practicing spiritual principles. When you're that cooked, you're going to want to get, that much help. And so that's basically what happened, After doing this much of a dive, it was only natural that I had to come to believe that something out there beyond me could separate my thinking from my thinking and help me maintain a spiritual condition for the day that would keep me sober for the day. So wherever folks are at in their spiritual journeys, whether you're just showing up, getting into the reading, getting into the writing, doing your sharing, doing amends, whatever, keep going with this stuff, and I wish you all the best. Thanks.